You know, one of my favorite books and movies actually is The Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, you know it's a fascinating tale of a little hobbit by the name of Frodo Baggins, who has a mysterious, dark, and powerful ring come into his possession. It wasn't his wish or his choice. It was actually forced upon him by his friend, the great wizard Gandalf the Grey. Now, Gandalf didn't force Frodo to take the ring because he wanted to harm him, but because it was harming his uncle and slowly corrupting him. And Gandalf thought the only person he could trust was this little boy. If you know the story or you've seen the movie, you know that Frodo's a hobbit. He's the most unlikely creature of all to be charged with this task, to carry the ring all the way to Mount Doom and to destroy it, to throw it into the fires of the mountains so that it would be permanently destroyed. For Frodo, it would mean going on a dark and dangerous journey all throughout the movie on the way to Mount Doom. At one point in the film and in the book, Frodo is discouraged. He's beaten up. He's exhausted. And he looks at Gandalf and he says, "I wish none of this had happened." It's a pivotal moment in the scene when Gandalf looks back and says, "Frodo, so do all who live to see such times, but it's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time given to us." It's a magnificent line, and it actually reminds me a lot of the book of Esther. The Lord of the Rings is written a lot like the book of Esther. God's name is not mentioned, and yet you see his hand at work behind the scenes. There's this interplay between sovereignty and providence and human responsibility, that God is at work, but that he calls us to participate in accomplishing his purposes in the world. As we continue our teaching series today on the book of Esther, we're going to move into chapter 4. It's the pivotal point in the story. Really, the climax has led us to this moment. Esther has largely been a passive character, but today she's invited to take action. She finds her voice at this pivotal moment in the story. We're going to read together today Esther chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Read along with me. It says that when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict was ordered, in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. As we pick up our text, we pick up from last week. Mordecai is understandably distraught. In fact, he's deeply distressed because the edict has gone out to annihilate all of the Jewish people, and it went out because of what he has done. The Bible says that he tore his clothes, which may seem strange, but in the Bible, it's actually symbolic and representative of those who are experiencing grief. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes when the people wanted to return to Egypt. King David tore his clothes on multiple occasions. Ezra tore his clothes when the people intermarried with Gentiles, and so on. But what's interesting in our passage is that such things are usually done after a calamity, not before it. That's not what happens here. Mordecai expresses his grief and his mourning before the death of his people. It's a testimony to just how irrevocably doomed they are. We keep reading in verse 4. It says, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to be put on instead of sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, as assigned to her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. You see, people wearing sackcloth and ashes were not allowed past the king's gate. So Esther sends a change of clothes, but Mordecai refuses. So then Esther sends a servant to see what is going on. And we read this intermediary is involved. Verse 6, so Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Verse 9. It says, Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and all the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go into the king. Esther's saying that Persian law forbids her from entering the king's presence. And we know from Herodotus, the Greek historian, that this was true. That, in fact, there were armed guards around the king's throne, and it was their job to execute anyone who entered in uninvited. You might think that the queen would get an exception, but not with this king. We've already seen in chapter 1 how he deals with his queens. We saw that with Queen Vashti. So Esther is afraid. But it gets more complicated, right? What Mordecai is asking her to do is to sort of win the favor of the king, but it seems like the king's affection for Esther has cooled. The Bible says it's been 30 days since she's been with the king, right? It's been 30 days since she's been invited to sleep with him, and this is a king who's likely not sleeping alone. So Esther is reluctant and she's fearful. We take notice. She doesn't immediately respond with courage and conviction. She is afraid, and she pushes back on what Mordecai is telling her to do. Verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. But who knows? But that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther is worried about the cost of taking action. Mordecai reminds her of the cost of inaction. Right? If she goes before the king, she may lose her life. But if she doesn't go before the king, she will lose his life. And he says, who knows? Who knows, Esther? But that maybe you are here precisely for this moment. See, I love this because he's talking about God's sovereignty and divine providence and how God has maybe been orchestrating things behind the scene. But even though God has been at work sovereignly, he still invites us to take responsibility. And he's saying, maybe, Esther, you're here. Maybe you've gone through all of this, right? Maybe the cosmetic treatments, maybe the removal from your home, maybe entering into the king's palace, maybe entering into his bed, maybe being one among many women that he sort of uses for his pleasure. Maybe all that has happened to you. Maybe God's orchestrating things behind the scenes so that there's a purpose to your pain. There's a purpose for you in this moment. Maybe you're here precisely for this moment, for such a time as this. He challenges her to see that maybe God has brought her here for this moment. Esther weighs this. She considers it. And then in verse 15, she sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. This is Esther's defining moment, right? She can either retreat into self-protective silence, or she can step out in faith and take the ultimate risk. Up to this point in the story, Esther has remained largely passive, right? She's been portrayed more or less as a pawn, not a queen, as someone who doesn't have much choice. But now she gets to make a choice. Will she choose to retreat, or will she choose to step into what God has for her? I want to look at what Esther chooses today. And I want to highlight three things that we see in the text. First, Esther chooses to humble herself before God. She chooses to identify herself with God. And lastly, she chooses to present herself to God. Those three things, that Esther humbles herself before God, that she identifies herself with God, and that she presents herself to God. She humbles herself before God. She identifies herself with God. She presents herself to God. And in so doing, she gives us a bit of a pattern to follow. I want to look at each one in turn. First, humble yourself before God. If you look at chapter 4, verse 3, it says, "In every province to which the edict and order of the king came," notice this, "there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing." Those three words, fasting, weeping, and wailing. We've spoken a little bit about how the crisis over the edict has driven the Jewish people to despair. But I want you to see that not only does it drive them to despair, the text seems to indicate it drives them to repentance. That phrase, fasting, weeping, and wailing, is language in the Bible of repentance, of people who are turning back to God. Remember last week we spoke of the word bewildered, which appears in Esther and only 3 other times in the Bible. In Esther 3, Exodus 14, and in Joel chapter 1. What I found fascinating this week is that phrase, those 3 words of fasting, weeping, and wailing, they appear only one other time together in the Bible, and it's in the book of Joel, also in chapter 2. In Joel chapter 2, God is calling his people to repentance, and he says this. He says, "Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart." Notice, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. "Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love." In the book of Joel, they're facing a national crisis. Locusts have eaten up all the land, and God calls them to respond with fasting, weeping, and wailing, to humble themselves and repent and turn back to God. I think that's what's happening in Esther among Mordecai and the Jewish people, right? They, in a land of feasting, they turn to fasting, and they're mourning, and they're weeping, and they're wailing. They're repenting. They're turning back to God. Mordecai tears his clothes, and Joel says, don't just tear your clothes, tear your hearts, not your garments, right? In Hebrew, in the Jewish custom, it was customary when you were grieving to tear your clothes. And God says, no, don't just tear your clothes or even change them. I want you to tear your heart, rend your heart, right? Let your heart be broken and contrite and return to me. So it doesn't matter who you are, or where you've done, or where you've been, or where you are in this moment. The invitation is for all of us to return back to God. Perhaps you're like the Jewish people who've assimilated to the culture around them. Perhaps you're like Mordecai, who's filled with hatred in his heart towards others, or maybe have made some compromises along the way. Perhaps you and I are like Queen Esther. We're living in the lavish luxury of a pagan palace in the land of Persia, right? Here's the invitation, no matter who you are, or where you've been, or what you've done, you and I can return to God. Esther and the Jewish people, they begin humbly. They humble their hearts before God, and they plead for his mercy and his forgiveness. They know his character, his grace, and his mercy, and they invite him to act. And so here's the invitation. Even now, turn to me. Humble yourself before God. Humble yourself before God. But secondly, we see Esther goes even further. She identifies herself with God, right? She identifies herself with God and his people. In verse 8, it says that Mordecai instructed her, and he told her to go into the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Take notice of that phrase. This is the first time when anyone knows whose Esther's true identity is. Right here, this servant, this intermediary, he hears that Esther is being challenged to intervene on behalf of her people. Mordecai is reminding her that she's Jewish, of who she really is, of her deep inward identity. She may have had her outward identity has changed. She's living in the king's palace, right? She's gone through all of these cosmetic treatments, but he's inviting her to embrace her true identity. To save her people, she must remember who she truly is. This issue of identity is so important in the book of Esther, right? She's the only character in the story who has two names. Esther is her Persian name, but her Jewish name is Hadassah, right? And in this text, she's sort of coming to grips with her identity, right? This is the moment when Esther, the Persian queen, remembers that she is Hadassah, the Jewish girl. See, Mordecai is challenging her to sort of leave the comfort and the familiarity and the life of the palace of the Persian queen and to remember who she really is and to embrace her God-given identity. I think as Christians, we often face the same challenge, don't we, right? We face a temptation to sort of retreat in silence as it relates to our Christian identity, right? We know the moment people find out that we're Christians or that I'm a pastor, that they're going to start to look at us differently, or that there may come a cost with being able to let people know who we truly are. I want to invite you today to embrace your unique, distinctive identity. You and I, we are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. We are a city on a hill, right? And we are called and invited to identify with Jesus. In fact, Jesus himself says in Matthew 10, everyone who confesses me before men, I will confess him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I'll deny him before my Father in heaven. And so we are invited, we are commanded as God's people to identify ourselves with God. We know there will be a cost, right? People will look at us differently, they'll treat us differently, and oftentimes there will be suffering that will be associated with being identified as the people of God. But if we're to live faithfully in our defining moments, we are called to identify ourselves with God. First, we see we're to humble ourselves before God. Secondly, identify ourselves with God. And lastly, we're to present ourselves to God. We see Esther presents herself to God. In what is one of the most beautiful lines in the entire Bible, Esther says this. She speaks up in verse 15, and she says to Mordecai, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do." She joins in the fasting of the people. She identifies with them. "When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Throughout the story, Esther has been passive, and now she speaks up. She finds her voice. She issues a command. She's no longer listening to the commands of others. She issues her first command as queen, right? This is a defining moment when Esther speaks up, and she thinks, maybe it's true. Maybe God has me here for such a time of this, and she willingly steps in and risks her life for the sake of others. In this way, Esther is a shadow of the greatest moment of history when another person would say something very similar, right? He wouldn't say, "If I perish, I perish." He would say, "When I perish, I perish." See, Esther's story and Esther's response and Esther's courage and conviction in this moment is really a shadow of one who had even greater courage, one who would not retreat into self-protective avoidance, one who would not take the path of least resistance, but one who would say, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. He would offer himself, present himself to God to accomplish his purposes and his plan. And he wouldn't just risk his life, he would give his life. See, Esther reminds me of the gospel and of what God has done for you and me in Jesus Christ, right? Jesus Christ, he humbled himself before God. He identified himself with the people of God. He took on human flesh. He identified himself with you and me. And then lastly, on the cross, he gave his life. He offered himself as a sacrifice, presenting himself as a perfect sacrifice for the sins of everyone who would believe in him. In so doing, Esther really models for us the gospel, the good news of what God has done for us in Christ. And I believe when we look at Esther and we think of the gospel and we think of what God has done, it compels us, it motivates us, it fuels us, you and me, to do likewise, to be a people who respond to the good news of the gospel by humbling ourselves before God, by not being afraid to identify ourselves with God, and then being willing, no matter the cost, to present ourselves to God. In the language of Hebrews, to present our bodies as living sacrifices, right? This is our spiritual act of worship. You and I were called to humble ourselves before God, to identify ourselves with God, and to present ourselves to God, to be a part of his plan and his purposes in the world. We started earlier with the story of Frodo Baggins, the hobbit in The Lord of the Rings, who was entrusted in this key moment to carry this ring, to do what really only he could do, and to carry the ring all the way to Mount Doom and destroy it. What's fascinating about what Tolkien does is he chooses a hobbit. Not a king, not an elf, not a royal figure, not anything else. He chooses what Tolkien calls the most unlikely creature imaginable to carry out this task. And I'd like to suggest that's intentional because Tolkien knows, he's writing from a Christian worldview, this is exactly how God works. God uses the most unlikely and ordinary creatures to accomplish his purposes in the world. Might it be true for you today that God has you where he has you for such a time as this, that you've been placed in this moment, that you and I, we're here in this time. We could be living in any time in human history, and yet we're here. And we have our history and our past and our experiences and our gifts and our abilities and all that God has entrusted to us, but that it's not an accident, it's not a mistake, it's not by chance, but that we are here and God has a plan and a purpose for each of us to follow his will for our lives in this moment. Might it be possible that God has something for us, good works that he's prepared in advance for us to do, and that it's our responsibility to respond to whatever he has for us in the moment we find ourselves in. I want to invite you today to press in, to lean in, to ask God, what is it that you have for me in my time and in my place? Humble yourself before God. Identify yourself with God and present yourself to God. Let's pray. Lord, my prayer is that we would be a community that is marked by these values, that we would be marked by humility before you, identification with you, and a willingness to present ourselves to you. I pray that we would open ourselves, Lord, wherever we are, at work, at school, at home, in our neighborhoods, and we would open ourselves to be used by you, agents of your goodness, your power, your hope, your deliverance in the world. Lord, we know and we trust that you have us here for such a time as this. I pray that as we look at Esther and we look at Jesus and we look at our own lives, Lord, that you would give us opportunities to step into the call, the unique call that you have for each and every one of us. May you do this by your power and your Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.